Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 90th audio file in the audiocast series known as the Q News Patriot. I am the Q News Patriot. My name is SGAnon. It is really fantastic to be back with each of you again, Patriots, for audio file 90. It's hard to believe that we're almost 100 episodes now into our extracurricular high-level analysis sessions. Your patience and grace with the release of this file in particular is well appreciated as I continue to navigate the waters of certain entanglements in my corner of the world. More than 70 days now into the third Trump presidency, and the American public's appetite for justice and accountability for criminal behavior committed by both public and private sector officials alike has never been higher. This is a point of view that I'm seeing increasingly reflected across the entirety of the political spectrum, from moderate left all of the way over to hardcore awake patriots, and it's something I can deeply empathize with, despite my sometimes uneventful presentation of things. The successful and publicly visible administration of that justice will result ultimately in the creation of the societal precedents, safeguards, and countermeasures that we need to move forward in order to prevent our very way of life from being weaponized against us or our children ever again. It's also helpful to remember, Patriots, that when we talk about justice, we are also talking about the post-justice transformation of the standard operating mechanisms across all of our society. And such a process is not easily accomplished, even under the very best and accommodating circumstances. To take it a step further, I think we could very reasonably argue that President Trump and patriotic forces in both militaries and law enforcements around the world between 2012 and 2016 inherited and began working with the absolute worst of possible circumstances, especially considering the aims and objectives that they had, like ending public corruption, while simultaneously stamping out some of the worst criminal practices imaginable, and correcting generational criminality committed at a civilization scale over decades, much of which involves difficult maneuvering on things like territorial security and control. What is for sure, Patriots, is that for several years now, we have watched this very process continue to move forward around the world and here at home in the USA, and at a much more accelerated pace in recent weeks and months, despite the rhetoric and concerns expressed by some in that same period that our triumph has been hijacked, co-opted, or that we've somehow been sold a bill of underwhelming goods with President Trump. I submit to each of you that these concerns, while certainly sincere in most cases, simply lack the perspective of the forest entire, due to that human tendency to focus solely and only on any number of trees that might present themselves during a long walk through a dark wood. The essence of our file today, Patriots, is to help each of you to step back and breathe a moment and take a look at the terrain laid out before us from a high altitude lens. The war is truly won, even with battlefields that yet require our efforts and attention, and some others that only need to be wound down and monitored. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into our discussion today. We're going to start our file with an excerpt from an email that was communicated to me several months ago from an alleged operator who described themselves as a, quote, paramilitary contractor currently engaged in raiding and destroying human smuggling dungeons inside South American cave systems, end quote. I chose not to share anything from this email or the email itself, Patriots, at the time that it initially arrived in my inbox because it was very close to the 2024 election period, despite having an authorization to do so in the body of the message. Almost 100 days now into the next publicly visible Trump presidency, though, it seems even more appropriate to read back over it and reflect on it with each of you. This particular excerpt was included about midway through the message, and I found it fascinating. It reads, World War III is being used as the public society-wide cover story for the largest active coalition military operation that has ever been undertaken. Red Zero and other Tier 1 levels of military command from all orbit-capable nations, as well as long-dormant force projection presences of a non-terrestrial sort, are introducing to the mass human awareness by way of a unified purpose an entirely new reality. This whilst also kinetically destroying and removing planetary-scale threats to the process in a top-down fashion, beginning with things that are called N.0 weapons. These would include things like UV and solar disruptors, atmospheric noble gases and oxygen weapons, X-ray concentrators, toroidal field weapons, and others. This international operation also includes mapping and responding to the speed of change occurring in human consciousness while protecting the population physically. And this balance is strategically analyzed 24 hours a day using super AI and quantum capable systems that inform next directions. This awakening process will ultimately result in a significant redesign of physical reality and societal understandings, which will be undeniable and not initially accepted at first, but which will fertilize the soil for humanity's expansion and abundance at levels that have not existed in simultaneous worldwide fashion for more than 13,000 years. Now, I have to say, Patriots, when I first read through this email, I was taken aback by the long-term and forward-thinking feel of it. Truly, if we're going to secure not just the United States, but the entirety of our planet for posterity, we have to build upon certain old world systems and completely redesign or eliminate others. And moreover, that building upon and tearing down process had to be well underway without the awareness of those living inside the same structures. I think President Trump, along with patriots occupying high level seats of power, has been aware of needing to tend to this balance from the very beginning, as have the arbiters of the deep state machine, who stand to lose everything for themselves and their own posterity if we as patriots are successful. This underlying idea of events presented to the general public in this moment as being either partially or wholly fictitious is really not far-fetched when we consider it, especially in light of things like the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, Project Bluebeam, and thousands of declassified FBI and CIA documents showing civilization scale narrative control. And if that's not so far-fetched, then equally so is the idea of that landscape being leverageable, for lack of a better word, by both good and bad actors alike. In fact, in recent days and weeks, I think we've seen exactly this from the TruthSocial profile of President Trump himself on an array of topics and subject areas. Remember, Patriots, the deep state and those who have pulled the shadow power puppet strings for decades felt so threatened by Donald Trump not even a year ago that a multi-level, multi-agency attempt on his life was made in broad daylight, with ballistics analysts agreeing afterward that between 2 and 4 separate shooters were discernible from the footage. Desperation is the best word to describe that sort of a maneuver by an enemy that has historically been calculated, very cunning, and very precise in their elimination of threats to the status quo. And publicizing that desperation suggests to me that in the minds of those shadow structure stakeholders and power players, Trump specifically is the embodiment of everything that has gone wrong with their globalist occult plan for total world domination. We're going to expand a bit more on this, and as we do so, Patriots, I want to challenge each of you to listen first, reflect second, and conclude last. All right, let me come over here. As I mentioned a moment ago, Patriots, President Trump is effecting almost as much political change around the world from posting on his TruthSocial as he is governing from the Oval Office. But what if some of that positive and lasting power change is being driven by way of a purposefully crafted presentation? And still further, what if some of that presentation is periodically employing lawful military deception? If we come over here to the president's truth profile, there's a particularly striking example of how this may very well be some of what we're witnessing in real time. Taken from President Trump's Truth account, posted a couple of weeks ago on 18 March 2025 at 9:36 p.m. Eastern Time, so that's 21:36 military time. We have a short video-only post, 16 seconds in length, which is also a cross-share of a 17-second long video that was published by U.S. Central Command 2 days prior on March 16th, 2025 at 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time or 19:20 military time, and that was published to the official CENTCOM X profile. In that post, CENTCOM stated, quote, "CENTCOM forces continue operations against Iran-backed Houthi terrorists," end quote. Now, we know from the Q boards that Tehran is and has been intrinsically linked with that broader worldwide hydra that we call the intelligentsia swamp for a number of decades now, really since the installation of the Shah in the mid-20th century. We also know from Q that Iran is one of several important keys for publicly unlocking and exposing parts of that deep state control matrix in problematic areas, including Ukraine, North Korea, and China. And even though Q doesn't directly address this one, I believe Tel Aviv and Israel as well. From Drop 4886, which was posted October 17, 2020, Ukraine, China, Iraq, Iran opens the door far beyond the Biden family. How do you protect your interests, shelter from prosecution and public awareness? control, infiltrate, DOJ, FBI, state, intel, and news. How many fired FBI, Russia mid-year agents received a book deal? Book deals can be lucrative. Follow the family. U.S. taxpayers paid for it all. Information warfare. Q. So Q basically tells us in the first sentence of this drop, Patriots, that Iran is a nexus of corruption that will materially affect the U.S. deep state's fall from power. Another drop, which was drop 3837 from February the 6th of 2020, ends with, quote, how many people removed from the FBI had Iranian family backgrounds? The silent war continues, end quote, Q. The last half of drop 3836, the one right before 3837, posted that same day, 25 minutes prior, reads, define projection. Think 1.8 billion Hussein White House to Ukraine. Which bank? Think U.S. aid to Ukraine. Think worldwide aid, Ukraine. Think Uranium One, sale of U.S. uranium to Russia, sold out U.S. to benefit Russia for personal financial gain. Risked U.S. national security for personal financial gain. How was payment made to U.S. persons? Think Ukraine. Think Iran. Russia and Iran allies. Russia, Iran, and China allies. U.S. political corruption, China. U.S. political corruption, Ukraine. U.S. leverage on behalf of ... U.S. political corruption, Russia. U.S. political corruption, Iran. Common denominator, China, Russia, and Iran. Closed financial systems. Logical thinking. Q. I could give each of you another 24 examples right here from Q highlighting that the Iranian deep state's foreign connections, including financial, political, and paramilitary, are ultimately going to be exposed as being directly tied back to Washington, D.C., the Koreas, Ukraine, China, ISIS, Russia, and countries throughout the broader Middle East before this process is over, Patriots. Right alongside this is another angle worth remembering, which is that of off-book militarized projects. We saw a similar situation to what is happening in Yemen right now, for example, during the early days of Trump's first presidential term in 2017, where he approved Tomahawk missile strikes into Syria, with the official narrative being given of chemical weapons used by Damascus. But Drop 1306, posted April 30th, 2018 at 11:51 and 6 seconds Eastern Time, told us a different story for why those strikes happened. It reads, define the terms of the Iran nuclear deal. Does the agreement define and confine cease and desist PRO to the Republic of Iran? What if Iran created a classified satellite nuclear facility in northern Syria? What if the program never ceased? What other bad actors are possibly involved? Did the U.S. know? Where did the cash payments go? How many planes delivered? Did all planes land in the same location? Where did the Uranium One material end up? Is this material traceable? Yes. Define cover. What if Uranium One material ended up in Syria? What would be the primary purpose? Sum of all fears. In the movie, where did the material come from? What country? What would happen if Russia or another foreign state supplied uranium to Iran and Syria? War. What does Uranium One provide? Define cover. Why did we strike Syria? Why did we really strike Syria? Define cover. Patriots in control. Q. Bearing all of this in mind, it is entirely conceivable to me, Patriots, that with the still unexplained disappearance of nuclear source material from New Jersey in December 2024 during transit for waste disposal, with less than a month later almost the same incident happening in Spain, which also involved industrial use radioactive material, that our current picture of events in Yemen and elsewhere in the Middle East, for that matter, may still be incomplete. And here's where it gets even more interesting. If we examine the timestamp of CENTCOM's X post from March 16, 2025, which was 7:20 p.m. EST or 1920 military time, and we subtract 1,920 days from March 16, 2025, it yields us a date of December the 13th, 2019. This was just 5 days before the impeachment of President Trump for the perfect phone call he had with Ukraine. December 13, 2019 also happens to be the same day that the DoD Inspector General's office released a partially redacted version of a classified internal audit report pursuant to FOIA requirements under 5 USC 552, which was titled Audit of Combatant Command's Integration of Space Operations into Military Deception Planning, DoDIG 2020-039. And this can be found at the same name online for viewing at dodig.mil/FOIA/FOIA reading room under the section Articles. The audit report is 34 or 17 times 2 pages long and was delivered to the Director for the Joint Staff, the Commanding Generals of Indo-Pacific Command, European Command, and Strategic Command, as well as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Charles Rood, and the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Mr. Joseph D. Kernan. Fascinatingly, and so soon thereafter that I can't believe it was just a random chance, Congress voted to redesignate the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence to Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, just 1 week after the report was compiled and delivered. Some portions are quite telling, with all of us having witnessed the sequences of events that we've witnessed over the last 5 years. Taken from page 3 of the document under background, Joint Military Deception, or MILDEC, is planned and conducted in a theater of operations to support military campaigns and major ops. Joint MILDEC activities are planned and executed by and in support of combatant commanders, joint force commanders, and joint task forces. The parallel with the post-2021 world seems obvious here, Patriots, since both combatant commanders and joint force efforts are an integral part of the success of any high-level military campaign, including something like balancing a continuity of government mission by way of devolution or other means. Coming down a little bit further from page 10 under military deception, MILDEC is an action executed deliberately to mislead adversary military, paramilitary, or violent extremist decision makers, thereby causing the adversary to take specific actions that would contribute to the accomplishment of the friendly mission when properly integrated with operation security and other information capabilities and the visible activities of the joint force and its components. MILDEC can be a decisive tool in altering the adversary's views, decisions, and actions. In other words, Patriots, when deception is successfully integrated with any military action that we and our deep state opponents are able to physically see transpiring, those opponents are more likely to react with disastrous countermoves that further our objectives without requiring extra effort. By this point, I'm sure I don't have to remind most of you of the myriad reasons for the establishment of Space Force to begin with, including cooperation with Special Operations Command, shaking up the Air Force chain of command at the top, force-wide communications management and oversight, and a full-spectrum surveillance capability, just to name a few. But just a thought here, what better way to catch a multi-theater opponent red-handed in their tomfoolery than to turn up the heat so much in one theater or many theaters that they overextend and make critical mistakes in others? What's more, all we really need to do is make them think that the heat has been turned up in that theater, whether or not it actually has. And they will make the same disastrous countermoves anyway, resulting in the same exposure and ultimate elimination. If we come a little further down in this document, Patriots, to page 21, it also references Joint Publication 3-13.4, which outlines planning considerations for integrating cyberspace operations and military deception together, and describes detailed methods for protecting information systems, including false servers, replication of information systems traffic, and false data storage decoys. It's worth recalling that the real Hillary Clinton went down on 9/11/2016 during the height of the email scandal, and those emails were kept on a redundancy server in China. Additionally, the Clinton, Kerry, and Obama families all have personal and business ties to Iran, as well as several other nations in Iran's sphere of influence, and it was Iran that received more than $2 billion cash in off-book transactions during the time of the Obama administration, with some of that stored in a bank account in, wait for it, Ukraine. And as if to ice the cake on a high-level irregular warfare scenario, when we take the timestamp of 16 seconds from the video DJT posted to his truth profile on 3/18 and the timestamp of 17 seconds from CENTCOM's X post on 3/16 2 days prior, we get 1716 due to CENTCOM's post happening first in linear time, which equals the power number of 33, and which also brings up Q drop 1716 from July 26, 2018. The body of that drop includes just a URL link to a Wall Street Journal article titled "Thank You, Jeff Sessions," published April 2018, which was an op-ed by William McGurn, and which focused on Sessions' appointment of Utah-based attorney John Huber for purposes of investigating complaints lodged against the DOJ and FBI by congressional representatives. That op-ed also highlights in the very first paragraph that Huber had begun working on these investigative efforts alongside the DOJ's own Inspector General beginning in November of 2017. And on the very same day it was published, another article appeared in the journal titled "Limit Iran's Influence in Iraq," which essentially was a giant calling out of the deep state intelligentsia elements inside Tehran and their intentions to prevent the Iraqi government from revaluing to a stable, independent economic system. Fast forward to the here and now, and who has President Trump blamed multiple times in recent months for orchestrating assassination plots? Iran. And is it also conceivable that those forces inside Iran, Patriots, would not reflect the entirety of the culture and people, and that they would also be operating in unison with U.S.-based traitors at all levels of government and law enforcement, to include potentially the FBI itself? I think Q Drop 247 from December of the 4th, 2017 basically says exactly this, as does Drop 586 from January 22nd, 2018, the very next month. Drop 247 reads, "Have you been watching the news since Friday? Who is Peter Strzok? How was he compromised? How was he paid? Who is Melissa Hodgman? Company? Title? Date of promotion? Focus on the date. What events regarding Peter recently occurred that you now know? Think HRC emails, Wiener laptop, etc. Dates? Date of promotion of wife? How do they stack the deck? Who do they want inside the government? What are puppets? How do you control a puppet? Number 2 in FBI? Wife connection? What is a pattern? Follow the wives. Keep watching the news this week. Future proves past. Reread crumbs. Small. How many Democrats and Republicans will not seek re-election? Why? What just passed in the Senate? Why? Who is their new handler? Do as told? Why is this relevant? Do you not understand the government is being gutted publicly? Bottom, middle, top. Hussein Iran connection. Bombs away. Merry Christmas. Q." Coming over here to the first portion of Drop 586, Q makes this picture even more plain. The first half of that drop reads, "What would happen if texts originating from an FBI agent to several internals discussed the assassination possibility of the POTUS or member of his family? What if the texts suggest foreign allies were involved? Forget the Russia setup, one of 22. This is only the beginning. Be careful what you wish for. As the world turns. Could messages such as those be publicly disclosed? What happens to the FBI? What happens to the DOJ? What happens to special counsel? What happens in general? Every FBI DOJ previous case could be challenged. Lawless." The drop goes on to discuss human trafficking and sacrifices, Patriots, and reminds us that the pure evil and corruption in the world's shadow power systems would be flat out unimaginable for the vast majority of the population. Now, for those of you who don't already know, Peter Strzok is the disgraced former FBI agent who led both the investigation into HRC's private email server and who was directly involved in the fake dossier and Russia collusion hoax that sought to undermine and overthrow a duly elected president of the United States. Most of you out there will probably be familiar with Strzok's role in these matters, as well as other efforts that tied back to Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Crossfire Hurricane investigation. But how many of you out there are also aware that Strzok attended elementary school in Iran, at the American school located in the capital, Tehran, prior to the Iranian Revolution? Did you also know that he attended St. John's Preparatory School in Minnesota, which is a private Benedictine Catholic school, graduating in 1987? To take it a notch further, his father, Peter Struck I, became involved in Catholic charities in what is now the modern-day African nation of Burkina Faso immediately after retiring as a 21-year lieutenant colonel from the U.S. military, and his uncle, James Struck, is a Jesuit priest father with a long record of, quote, humanitarian activities, end quote, in the eastern portions of Africa, including Somalia and Ethiopia. Additionally, Struck Jr. joined the FBI in 1996 as an intelligence research specialist immediately after serving time as a military officer, and under Hussein Obama, he became the FBI's section chief for the Counterespionage Division, which is a subordinate section of the FBI's counterintelligence arm. It seems entirely possible to me, Patriots, and even plausible in some ways, that President Trump is right now in this moment telling us without telling us that, at least as it relates to Iran and the Iranian-aligned entities, there's much more going on there than the indiscriminate bombing of civilians under the guise of anti-terrorism operations. And for the record, no matter who the American executive might be, I would always condemn such an approach to international affairs. But Trump got himself elected on a landslide platform that was pronouncedly anti-foreign war and anti-U.S. involvement in foreign wars. And I think the man is aware that if he chooses to renege on that particular campaign trail pledge, he's going to sink both his legacy and jeopardize his family's future here in the USA. As a businessman myself, I can't see the ROI of such a choice being acceptable to him, and I think some trust and patience is owed to the president, even if his strategies don't yet seem to make sense to us, especially when dynamics like the type I just described to all of you are likely still factors in the larger mission to remove the worldwide swamp. We would do well to remember that the actual levers of power in the world are typically vastly different and much more insular and concentrated than what the general public is aware of at any given time. And we are not even 100 days yet into this new phase of our journey together. I imagine this is the point in our file, though, where some of you may be sitting back saying, SG, okay, fine. I can get behind a lot of what you're presenting to us as relevant and important, but why is Trump clearly giving the appearance of shilling for a certain foreign power, which is itself a modern-day creation of the Rothschild family's empire-building activities around the world? And yes, I will concede the point to each of you that the optics in that particular arena have significant benefit, but also significant pitfalls, especially when measured against the precision that the digital army is going to bring to the information war. Yet, in my opinion, Patriots, if we're going to start with the premise that there is, in fact, an ongoing, worldwide, highly irregular, specially compartmented espionage war, which is actually the true driver for the current geopolitical changes happening all across the planet, then we cannot effectively analyze any theater of operations wherein those changes are occurring if we fail to use the proper lens for that analysis. Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are no different in that sense to me, and this short video that I'm about to show each of you does an excellent job at highlighting the importance of us remembering that in an espionage war, where the prize is world peace, abundance, and tranquility for mankind, infiltration does indeed have to work in both directions. Major props also behind the Anon, or to the Anon behind the X account KAG Drogo for this post, which was put out on that account just after Christmas this last year on December the 27th. Hang on just a moment here, Patriots. All right, Patriots, we're going to watch this video here. I've got it pulled up on this end. It's just over a minute or so. And as we listen to this, I'd like each of you to pay very close attention to what the president says.
Some of our so-called allies that we work with and we protect them militarily, they're sending massive amounts of money to ISIS and to Al-Qaeda.
So who are you talking about there?
You know who it is. What do I have to bring it up for? You know who it is.
Because you're running for president. Are you talking about the Saudis?
Joe, other countries are giving massive amounts of money. People from other countries are giving massive amounts of money.
Are you saying the Saudis are doing this?
Of course they're doing it. Everybody knows that.
Okay. Any other countries?
There are, but I'm not going to say it because I have a lot of relationships with people. But there are. And you know that, and everybody knows that, and nobody says it. Nobody.
Now, it doesn't get more plain than that, Patriots. Some of our so-called allies who we protect are sending massive amounts of money to ISIS. The Saudis are doing it. Everybody's doing it. Other countries are doing it, but I'm not going to say it because I have a lot of relationships with people, but you know who they are. Everybody knows that, but nobody says it. These words coming from the mouth of the same man, by the way, who is at ground zero on 9/11/01 within hours of the attack that killed more than 3,000 Americans, who knew the buildings had been professionally demolished, and who in his first term as POTUS destroyed the functional capabilities of ISIS, stopped the uranium-1 nuclear world war setup, and relentlessly pursued the Rothschild family financial control arms all across the planet, beginning with Saudi Arabia. I think it's fair to say, Patriots, that Lao Tzu had it right. In total war, you must appear one way when you are really in another. And that approach is certainly not limited to kinetic maneuvers or geopolitical hobnobbing either. We've witnessed over the last 8 years, for example, a categorical and undeniable move away from the old world financial system of commerce and value exchange, much of it predicated on empty promises and worthless underpinnings, and towards one expressing a multipolar, standardized valuation balance with real assets and resources and a decentralization for international pathways of control. In recent weeks, this process has been front and center not just for the population of the USA itself, but the entirety of the trade-based world, and we've seen more than $10 trillion worth of fiat usury value vanish from the American stock market since January 1st of 2025. Now, I'm not a financial advisor, Patriots, but for perspective, that number is more than 50 times greater than the total estimated stock market losses between the crash of 1929 and the close of fiscal year 1959, which are estimated to be around $190 billion over a 30-year period. And yet our fuel pumps are still pumping, our banking access and commerce capabilities are mostly preserved, except for certain scenarios of politically motivated debanking. And our overall way of life also remains mostly contiguous and functional, which interestingly is the primary and main purpose of any large-scale continuity of government mission, regardless of where or how it is being administered. In my opinion, Patriots, as we come into the new financial year, starting with Liberation Day, we're going to see the build out for this new financial landscape become increasingly more obvious to the general public. And we will also see the actualization of something that I've been telling each of you happened in kinetic fashion more than 4 years ago, specifically the absorption of the Federal Reserve Bank and its entire balance sheet into the Treasury Department, along with a subsequent repurposing of associated financial agencies like the Infernal Robbery Service. I would even go so far as to say that we're going to see this change become public in the coming months and not years. And an article from Yahoo Finance from March of 2020 reminds us of how it's likely to manifest. The article, titled "The Fed's Cure Risk Being Worse Than the Disease," was published on Yahoo Finance on the 27th of March, 2020, and it's a fascinating read that I encourage each of you to check out. What I found especially telling, though, is that towards the beginning of the piece that was authored by Jim Bianco, we essentially got a blow-by-blow breakdown for how this process may later publicly materialize. Taken from the article, starting in the second paragraph, in just the past few weeks, the Fed has cut rates by 150 basis points to near zero and run through its entire 2008 crisis handbook. That wasn't enough to calm markets, though, so the central bank also announced $1 trillion a day in repurchase agreements and unlimited quantitative easing, which includes a hard-to-understand $625 billion worth of bond buying per week going forward. At this rate, the Fed will own 2/3 of the Treasury market in a year, but it's the alphabet soup of new programs that deserve special consideration, as they could have profound consequences for the functioning of the Fed and the allocation of capital, in financial markets. Now, the Fed isn't allowed to do any of this. The central bank is only allowed to purchase or lend against securities that have government guarantee. This includes Treasury securities, agency mortgage-backed securities, and the debt issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. An argument can be made that it can also include municipal securities, but nothing in the laundry list above. So how can they do this? The Fed will finance a special purpose vehicle for each acronym to conduct these operations. The Treasury, using the Exchange Stabilization Fund, will make an equity investment in each SPV and be in a first loss position. So what does this mean? It means, in essence, the Treasury, not the Fed, is buying all these securities and the backstopping of loans. The Fed is acting as the banker and providing financing in that process. The Fed hired BlackRock to purchase these securities and handle the administration of the SPVs on behalf of the owner, the Treasury. So, in other words, the federal government is nationalizing large swaths of the financial market. The Fed is providing the money, BlackRock will be doing the trades, and this essentially merges the Fed and Treasury into one organization. So, meet your new Fed chairman, Donald J. Trump. Now, in my opinion, Patriots, and again, I'm not a financial advisor, but the entire process described to us in 2020 appears to show me some evidence of a publicly visible repurposing of seized assets that began around that period of time, both from foreign and domestic enemy combatants, as well as from civilian entities within U.S. jurisdiction, including entire organizations who had been ensnared under the national emergencies declared in EOs 138, 138, 48, and several others. And if we go a little further down in that article, it states, in effect, the Fed is giving the Treasury access to its printing press. This means that in the extreme, the administration would be free to use its control and not the Fed's of these SPVs to instruct the Fed to print more money so it could buy securities and hand out loans in an effort to ramp financial markets higher going into the election. And why stop there? If Trump should win re-election, he could use these SPVs to get those 10,000 Dow Jones points he feels the Fed has denied everyone. So, Patriots, when we couple these events that happened inside Treasury and the Federal Reserve with the fact that the Treasury has also spent nearly $400 million on just raw silver bullion from the London bullion market in the last 8 months from this particular file, it becomes clear that there is a race against the clock underway that began several years ago inside the Western world to position the U.S. and Wall Street economic systems, and by extension worldwide markets of all sorts, for a historic shift in their basic operating fundamentals. How soon this is going to occur publicly for us is anybody's guess, but I would not be surprised if we saw it beginning to actualize as early as summertime this year and moving forward. And as recently suggested by an alleged glitch that happened in the price point of XRP USD during a live news broadcast, which showed XRP's valuation being north of $21,000 per coin, this shift is no doubt going to lead to the creation of entirely new sub-ecosystems as well, under the broader umbrella of international economics and trade. And if you're one of those patriots following these areas of interest especially closely, I would recommend over the coming months and years to be in touch with your wealth or financial advisors for advice on positioning. You know, patriots, we are entering now into the springtime of 2025, a full 17 years after the worldwide deep state's 16-year plan to destroy America was put into motion, beginning in earnest in 2008. Said another way, we have now officially and demonstrably outlasted those who have sought and schemed for centuries to destroy both humanity and the earth, and they are now running in fear at our every advance. As we end our file today, coming up now on close to an hour of analyzing and chewing over these events happening in different areas around the world, I find myself awestruck yet again at the scope of what we as patriots from our little corners of the world are actually accomplishing, and how much territory and ground we've gained and kept since President Trump's first walk down the escalator in 2015. We have stared the worldwide Leviathan Hydra and its associated juggernaut system of evil square in its black, soulless eyes, neither flinching nor backing down. And I am just not capable of describing with words of any kind how amazing it feels to be on the same team as each of you out there, wherever you are, and whatever you may be dealing with along your personal journey. In addition to my usually cheery final remarks, patriots, I'm going to extend to each of you today a request and a friendly challenge, specifically that once you finish listening to this file, that you'll purposefully close out of all of your screens and devices, including these wonderful and sometimes terrible mobile computers that we all carry around, and spend just 2 minutes focused solely and only on having an intimate and grateful conversation with your ageless and loving God, who signed your DNA and who is aware of you in every moment of every day, in both the good and the bad. While you do so, really try and feel the beating of your heart within your chest, or the echo of total silence in your ears. Maybe try to notice the heat of the sun's rays against your face, or the temperature of the air entering and exiting your nose. For just the next 2 minutes after you close off our file today, enter into that court with thanksgiving and feel the streak of divinity that pulses through the very essence of your being, which is your true identity and birthright. For now, Patriots, this is SGAnon. I hope you have a phenomenal afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are. And I'll be back with each of you again soon on the Q News Patriot. God bless everyone. Stay safe today. Thanks. Bye-bye.